Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the best case scenario for Donald Trump and JD Vance in the upcoming 2024 presidential election. I'll be filling out this map, we'll be talking about a number of different scenarios, but what it's going to come down to is what would the election look like come November if between now and then everything goes right for Donald Trump? What would the electoral map look like? And so 2 days ago, I did this video for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So if you want to see that, go click the channel, check that out. It's from 2 days ago, so you'll have no problem finding it. But today I'll be doing it for Donald Trump and JD Vance. So we're going to start out by filling out the states that no matter what would be safe for them. And most of these states wouldn't change, but what you'll see is that they do start out with, maybe a couple more electoral votes off the bat. So they're going to get to, I think, 129 that would be safe for them in the best case scenario. And then for states that would vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz by a safe margin no matter what, they're going to start out with a similar amount. I think it would be fair to say, maybe some of the states on the East Coast would narrow up a little bit, but broadly speaking, I don't think this would be too different from what you normally expect to see. And yeah, so Harris and Walz would start out with, at the very worst, 105 safe electoral votes. Donald Trump and JD Vance start out with 129. And now we've got a bit of a battleground here. We've got some states that could be competitive in a best case scenario for Trump and Vance. But before we get into any of that, let's talk about the national polls for a second, because these are going to really inform how the Electoral College looks. So right now, Kamala Harris is up by 3.3%, but she's had a good week of polling. She hasn't trailed in a poll since Echelon on August 25th. So it's been about a week since she trailed. And this isn't a great pollster. I think the last genuinely good or decent pollster that she didn't have a lead in was RMG. She was down by 2 in their poll from August 14th. So she's had a really good, past 2-3 weeks of national polling. But at the end of the day, she's still only up by 3.3%. And if you go to the 2020 polls, Joe Biden led by 8.4 on election day, and he won by 4 points less. So again, if the polling error, and a lot of this comes down to how bad the polls are, if we see a 2020 levels polling error on the national polls, Trump would win the popular vote by, around half a point, around 0.6%. So that obviously would be a very bad outcome for Kamala Harris. I'm not saying I think it's going to happen, but in a best case scenario, if things go right for Trump, maybe the polling error is the same. The polls aren't fixed. They underestimate Republicans once again. And so Trump would be ahead in the popular vote by maybe under a point. And even then, the polling risk could be bigger in 2020. Maybe he wins the popular vote by, a full point instead of half a point. So in this scenario, we're just assuming Trump would narrowly win the popular vote, which he didn't do in 2016, by the way. So this would be his best performance yet. But let's get into it. We're going to start out by filling out the likely Republican states. Some of these are going to be pretty obvious. The ones we already would normally have in likely, like Alaska, Florida, Ohio, and Texas would join that. So this is kind of the floor for Trump, 219 electoral votes. But we're going to add a few more here. So the first one that I'm going to add really is going to be the state of Nevada. Now, Nevada is interesting because it tends to be very close. There's not like a ton of outcomes that have happened here. And in the past 2 elections, it was decided by like 2%. So this is a kind of a far reach here. But in a best case scenario for Trump, maybe he wins it by 5 because it's a right trending state. The polls there show a pretty close race. And in 2020, they did underestimate Trump, although historically they have underestimated Democrats. But let's say the polling misses the same. And let's say Harris loses Nevada. Or because, again, if we look at 2020, the polls here, Biden was up by 5.3. He won it by 3 points less. So let's say we adjust the polls. Harris is down by 2 in Nevada. And then, trends kick in. We see the Democrats have poor turnout in Las Vegas, which was a problem for them in 2020 and to an extent 2022. So overall, it's a reach, but I think this state could maybe be a 5-point win for Trump in a best case scenario. Now for Harris, she's going to win some more states here. Oregon, Colorado, she'd win, I think, no matter what. Although the margin could be smaller. She'd still win Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and New York. So you're going to kind of see the return of the typically safe blue states here. Because again, these are states that in 2022, especially like in New York and Delaware, narrowed up. But realistically, Harris wouldn't win them by anything less than like 12 or 13. And then same thing with Illinois. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here for this likely electoral votes for Harris. And then this is kind of the battleground, as you can see. We're going to get into the lean Trump states. I think he'd have a solid chance at winning in the best case scenario, kind of the swing states by lean margins, right? Like Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that would get him to 312 electoral votes. And all these states are similar in that they were decided by under 3% in 2020. And most of these states were marginal Biden states. North Carolina voted for Trump by a point, so maybe it's a bit redder than the rest of these. But it is a left-trending state, and the polls have had it pretty close. I think at best Trump wins it by like 4. But here's what I think. So Arizona, to me, has a really wide range of outcomes. I could see Harris winning it by 4 or 5, but I could also see Trump winning it by 4 or 5. But again, if we take a look at the polls have gotten better for Trump in the past few days here. He was down by, point and a half a few weeks ago. He's only down by 0.2 now, and that's because we've kind of seen better polls from him from like Emerson and even Morning Consult had him tied there. So there's some momentum for him in Arizona. I'm not saying it's like a real thing, but in the best case scenario, he'd probably win it by 4 or 5. Georgia, similar. Democrats have a pretty big floor there because in 2022, obviously we saw Republicans sweep every statewide race except for the Senate race. And also, Democrats in Georgia really need a high black turnout to be competitive. And if black turnout falls more than it did in 2022, Democrats could be, or Kamala Harris could lose the state just no matter what. And then obviously, potentially, there's voters in the suburbs who are concerned about the economy. Maybe you don't like Trump, but are going to come home from him because we've seen that the approval ratings on the economy for Biden are not good. And obviously, if you're a big believer in the, economy is everything political theory, I think that would broadly be bad for Kamala Harris in a state like Georgia. And then I think North Carolina is similar. I already touched it a little bit, but this is a state that voted for Trump by a point in 2020. It is left trending overall. I do maintain that opinion. But again, turnout here can be pretty flaky for Democrats. We've seen a lot of bad results for them historically when black turnout falls. And again, in a best case scenario for Trump, Democrats are less energized by November while Republicans maintain high enthusiasm. They could get a huge turnout advantage in North Carolina. Now, the Rust Belt, these states are not a monolith, and I'm going to kind of just address them as one. So these states obviously are Democratic leaning. In 2022, Democrats broadly did well across these 3 states, especially Michigan and Pennsylvania. And the Republicans haven't won a federal race in Michigan, Pennsylvania since 2016, and then Wisconsin in 2022, Ron Johnson won. So I think Wisconsin's the easiest, but the 3 of these, the path to victory is similar. It's Democratic turnout needs to fall in the big cities, right? Like Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia are the big 3 across these states. And then you also have to look at working class voters because Donald Trump did very well with working class voters in both 2016 and 2020 when he held on to most of those gains. But there's still room to grow, right? Like take the towns outside of Detroit, Michigan on the northern side, like Warren, even go up north to Flint. Those are areas where Biden did relatively well, and Trump can still improve there. In Wisconsin, there's rural parts of that state where Trump is nowhere near his maximum. There were counties where Biden got like 37, 38% of the vote that he had no business even getting 30% in. So rural Wisconsin is good for the GOP long term, so maybe Trump taps into some of that. Pennsylvania is the hardest, I think, in terms of just a big margin because it's such a close state fundamentally. But yeah, like the Republicans could definitely come, maybe improve a little bit in rural Pennsylvania. They could hope Democratic turnout falls in Philadelphia, and then Pennsylvania is a lot more suburban than, say, Wisconsin, so it's kind of like the Georgia thing where you need voters in the suburbs who don't like Trump to just vote for him because of the economy, which the polls show that Trump does better on the economy than Harris or Biden. So, yeah, those are the states I think Trump would win by a lean margin. Now, Harris is going to get, I'm going to give her one of these states. I think New Mexico she'd still win by like 2 or 3. We only have like 2 polls there, and they're both like broadly pretty, like they're fine for Harris. They don't really show any signs of this being a close race. We had Harris plus 11 in Emerson, then Harris plus 7 in Redfield, which is, I think, those are 2 outcomes that could definitely happen. But in a best case scenario, maybe it narrows down to a 3-point margin, just because potentially Trump gains with rural Hispanic voters, which in 2020 he did, but in New Mexico, Biden kind of held up. And then obviously Democratic turnout in cities like Albuquerque and Santa Fe falls. But it's a small state, and Democrats do have a pretty high floor here, so I don't think Trump would really win it or come close to winning it. And then, the rest of these states I think are toss-ups in this scenario. To me, this might be this might be a controversial opinion for a best case scenario Trump video, but I still think that Harris would win Virginia, although very narrowly. I mean, actually, you know what? I think just to kind of be interesting, because I know a lot of people are going to wait for this, I'd pick Trump to win Virginia, and that's just because Virginia is a redder state than people think, and I'm not saying this to indicate that I actually think it's competitive in any scenario other than the Trump best case scenario, but like in 2020, Biden did win it by 10, but in 2021, Republicans did very well in the governor's race. In 2022, obviously, Democratic turnout was bad, but like the House race, the Virginia House popular vote was only like D+4, and that was an environment where Democrats otherwise did okay in the House. So I could definitely see, Virginia narrowing up. I think at best for Trump, realistically, he'd still lose by 2 or 3. But in a pure best case scenario, maybe Democratic turnout falls lower than anyone expects, and Virginia votes for Trump by like an Al Gore, Florida 2000 margin. So I don't know. I don't really think a lot about Virginia because I know it's not competitive in any real election. But in a best case scenario for Trump, if everything goes right, I could see him winning Virginia incredibly narrowly. That being said, I still think he'd lose Minnesota and Nebraska's second district. Obviously, in Minnesota, Tim Walz is from there. I think that kind of saves it. If the running mate were, say, Josh Shapiro or anyone else or Andy Bashir or whoever, I could see Trump winning Minnesota by a point in the best case scenario for him. But I'm not going to pick against Harris and Walz in any situation in Minnesota, realistically. And then Nebraska's second district, this might be a hot take, but I still think Harris would win it by like half a point. In Nebraska 2 and Virginia would be the closest, but the difference is that in Nebraska 2, Democrats actually outperformed in the House, while in Virginia they did not. And Nebraska 2 is a lot more left-running than Virginia, and it has been for the past really 4-6 years. Democrats also are making a play here. Tim Walz is from here. They're going to campaign here a lot because they know this could be an electoral vote that's very important in a very close election. So I don't see, like, turnout could fall, but Democrats are going to make a play for it, and it's a smaller district that's pretty educated, and it's a seat that turnout doesn't really fall a lot in midterms in, whereas there's other parts of the country where turnout does fall more, so there's kind of less room for turnout to fluctuate in this district. So I think there's less of a floor there for Harris than there would be in, say, North Carolina, Georgia, or Virginia. And then the final state's New Hampshire. Oh, and also I forgot to do Maine, but I think they're going to be similar here. I would maybe pick Maine to go for Trump by like 2, and then maybe New Hampshire by like 1 or 2. They're similar. Like, these are mostly white states in New England. They're pretty educated. They're pretty socially liberal. But the problem for Democrats here is that in the best case scenario, we'd see obviously rural Maine would turn out, while the coastal first district, which is still pretty solidly Democratic, would not turn out. In 2016, Donald Trump actually only lost Maine by 3 points. He didn't really make a play for it. He actually could have won it if it were not for Evan McMullin or Gary Johnson. Obviously, Jill Stein did hurt Hillary Clinton too, but that's kind of beside the point. The one thing to think about here is that ranked choice voting would come into play, I believe. So, or would it? I'm not sure if that applies to the presidential election. I know it applies to down ballot races, but whatever. But that, best case scenario, not likely to happen in real life. Best case scenario for Trump, white voters swing massively against Kamala Harris. We see rural turnout from the second district be a lot higher than turnout from the coastal first district. That's enough to win the state. And then New Hampshire, Trump lost here by 2,000 votes in 2016. The Republicans have not done well here in the past 8 years since Trump, but in a best case scenario, I think we see, New Hampshire's a weird state. A lot of things have happened, a lot of kind of things you don't expect have happened here. So, it's been close in the past. I think in a best case scenario for Trump, he could maybe win it by like a point. But yeah, that's the map in a best case scenario for Trump. He'd win 331 electoral votes. Kamala Harris would win 207. She'd still hold on to Minnesota and Nebraska too, which is a good sign for her. But again, in this map, we're assuming Democratic turnouts down, independent voters swing towards Trump in a pretty substantial way, and Republicans stay energized and they turn out at a 2016 or 2020 level rate. So that's the day that's the video for today. Let me know if there's any states you disagree with. If you think Donald Trump could, maybe win Minnesota or Nebraska's second district, or maybe you think Kamala Harris wouldn't lose one of the states I gave to Trump in a best case scenario. So again, let me know. Tell me what you think. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Comment down suggestions, and I'll see you all tomorrow.